Okay, good evening, everyone. No, we gotta do better than that. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Thank you. This is a Black Diaspora gathering here, at least in spirit. I think we're gonna get started. My name is Frank Guridy. I'm Professor of History here and of African American and African Diaspora Studies. And I also have the distinct honor of being the Executive Director of the Eric Holder Jr. Initiative in Civil and Political Rights. Founded in 2017, the Holder Initiative, which is housed in Columbia College, is designed to inspire our students to do impactful civic engagement and social justice work through internships, through dynamic programming, through community engagement. The Holder Institute initiative is about trying to create doing the hard work of democracy work, right? Which is hard work, as we know, and we will learn much more about the history of that hard work with respect to voting rights in our conversation tonight. So I'm super excited to be here. My job is just to say hello and welcome and to tell you about the Holder Initiative and to introduce those who were instrumental or central in putting together this amazing event. I want to thank Beth Manchester, who was thanked earlier, but she can't be thanked enough. She's in the back of the room. Who makes everything happen with the Holder Initiative, and she did so with this conference. I want to thank the members of the Black Law Students Association, who are the ones who convened this amazing gathering of the Paul Robeson Conference. Applause for them, too. Distinguished alum and Robeson, someone who deserves a revisit in so many ways. I'm super excited to know about this conference and to start the conference off with this amazing event. So thank you, and I'd like to introduce right now Alison Chavez and Onuoha Odum, who will get our program going. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Guridy, for the wonderful introduction and for your support of this year's conference. Welcome to the Black Law Students Association of Columbia Law School. Welcome, Dean Jelani Cobb. Welcome, Attorney General Eric Holder. As we kick off this year's Paul Robeson Conference, it's important to note that today marks the first time we're able to host the conference in person since 2019. Not only was this feat possible because of the dedication and leadership of the Black Law Students Association, but also because of the commitment of the Holder Initiative and the drive of Beth Manchester, Senior Associate Director of the initiative.
So now I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson was an athlete, an actor, a lawyer, a civil rights activist. As the son of a runaway slave that escaped at 15 and made his way up north, Robeson was an undeniable advocate for liberty and freedom. He was fearless, confronting then-President Truman in a face-to-face meeting in the White House where he demanded government action against the reign of terror and lynchings that afflicted the Black community. Robeson famously filed a petition with the United Nations charging the U.S. with genocide against the African American community. But his boldness and determination were not without a cost. His performing career suffered. No hall would have him, and his acting career was virtually over. Because he did not want to publicly take back his advocacy, the State Department denied him a passport. His rights were denied, but his spirit could not be broken. Robeson was determined to be a vocal advocate for Black liberation and civil rights. In the foreword of his autobiography, Here I Stand, Robeson asked, "What future can America have without the free and unfeathered contribution of our 60 million? What honor can our country have in a world becoming when our heritage is still denied?" Today, we're still asking those same questions.
This year's theme, Black Politics and the Future of American Democracy, encapsulates the contemporary struggle for the ballot people of color still face, from redistricting to felon disenfranchisement through mass incarceration to polling tactics. Our unfinished march exemplifies some of the revelations that our esteemed alumnus, Attorney General Eric Holder, Columbia College Class of 73, and Columbia Law School Class of 76 has gleaned. Now there is a significant amount of untapped potential for progressive growth in politics that will allow large numbers of individuals who might not otherwise participate in politics to find more reasons to do so. So here in a conversation over his new book, Our Unfinished March, and through this year's conference, we will unravel the nuances of election law, gerrymandering, and voter disenfranchisement with the help of scholars and practitioners in the field and find our political voices. Here in a joint fireside conversation, Attorney General Eric Holder and Dean Jelani Cobb.
Good evening.
All right. What's happening, my brother?
How you doing?
All right.
So, it occurred to me that we have done dialogues of this sort probably 3 or 4 times, and it's never good news. So I thought we would just switch it up and.
You gonna find some good news?
No, we're just going to do a sports podcast, which will be good news unless you are like an Eagles fan.
Well, or unless you're a New York Knicks fan.
Oh, well, that's never good news.
That's
So, never good news. So, I do know I want to start with a preface, you know, in the context of Paul Robeson, who was a person I spent a lot of time studying because his life intersected in significant ways with my interests as a historian. But the idea of Robeson existing was purely a product of Paul Robeson existing. And what I mean by that was, if you were to tell the narrative of his life, that someone who was born the son of former slaves, who went to Rutgers, graduated as valedictorian, lettered in, well, I forget how many sports while he was there, but the dominant athlete and the dominant academic figure at the university being the same person, who then graduates from Columbia Law School, almost on a whim decides that he wants to become an actor and becomes the greatest Othello of his era, of his age, one of the most important Shakespearean actors ever. And then almost on another whim becomes an internationally renowned folk singer, polyglot, speaker of multiple languages. People would tell you that this was a character from a Marvel movie. And only because his true genius, and all those other things that we could see, but his true genius was being able to conceive of this possibility for himself, of the person that he actually became. And so I'd say all that to say that when I started at Rutgers as a PhD student, and my first day of classes, which some of you may have experienced in your first day of law school, or maybe not, but my first day of classes, I was like really anxious, and I was really like, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into? Am I smart enough to be here? And I had a notebook, and I wrote 2 words on the front page, first page of that notebook. I said, these will be the first 2 words that my entire graduate school career begins with. Those words were Paul and Robeson, who had graduated from Rutgers University. I was calm after that. And so I think that it's important that we recognize that, and I think it is amazing that you have pulled together this conference and this gathering in recognition of what Paul Robeson meant, and certainly am honored and humbled to be able to participate this, and I'm always happy to be able to talk with you as well. So I guess we can just...
How do we, after that preface, thank you all very much.
Yeah, it's been good. We're going to go home now. All right, we're going to sing some folk songs. We can just jump right into it, which is, I'll start with the question that I have posed to you, multiple times before, which is, how did we get here in this moment where we are battling for rights that people might have previously believed were secured, that were not issued, that not at stake anymore?
Yeah. It's interesting, Jelani. I think that we've always been here. We've always been in this moment, and that's the nature of the American experience. There's always been this push and pull between those who have power and who want to hold on to it, and those who try to, I think, I'm revealing a bias here, try to create a better America, an America that is more consistent with its founding ideals. And that push and pull has defined our history. And what we're going through now, the particulars are different. We're talking about, gerrymandering in a way perhaps we didn't talk about it before. We're talking about attacks on our electoral infrastructure in ways we haven't done before. One of our political parties has kind of lost its mind in a way that we've not seen before. And yet the underlying struggle is one that we have seen, since the founding of the Republic. I mean, when I talk about, in our unfinished march, about, who has the right to vote. We're talking about that at the beginning of the Republic, and the determination was made that only white men could vote, only white men with property, could vote. And so that expansion of the franchise, I think, is one reflection of that that ongoing struggle that we've had in this country since we've called ourselves America. I think our tech working.
Oh, really? Can you hear me?
You know what? I have to turn it on. The great technician that I am. Is that better?
Oh, all right. Can you just repeat everything you just said?
Man, that was a really good answer, too.
Oh, right.
Somebody transcribe that, can read it back?
So, we're looking at an iteration of an older problem, of something that we've seen before.
Which doesn't mean that it is not, that we ought to be complacent about it, or that we should feel comfort in the fact that we have been through something like this before. There was a struggle to get through that which we faced before. There has to be a struggle now to get through that which we face now. And in some ways, the fact that, and I don't want to be too partisan about this, but I also want to be factually accurate here. The fact that one of our two political parties has seemingly turned its back on this notion of democracy. I mean, at a base level, like if you get more votes, that's how you get more power. Turning the back on that means that although this feels familiar in a lot of ways, and given the passage of time, it's more troubling, because you think we would be in a better place 230 whatever number of years that, since the founding.
Yeah, so what's interesting about that is, I talk with my students, because these dynamics have been present in different forms, but I said we were talking about the Democratic Party, and it's early 20th century and mid 20th century political inclinations, which are very different than the current version of it. And I'll talk to my students and say, why was Mississippi so dead set on preventing black people from voting? And why South Carolina and Louisiana, Alabama? And especially if I'm teaching like the undergrads, like the answer is like they were racist. That's too easy. No, I mean, sure, okay, but there's racism in a lot of places. Why were they, so completely committed to preventing this? And I'm always like, the answer is very simple. There were a lot of black people in those places.
Right.
There were a lot of voters who could turn the tide of an election. And when we think about it, like now, as has always been the case, the majority of black people in this country live in the South. Mississippi's 40-some% black. Louisiana's in the high 30s. Georgia's in the quarter, usually a quarter to a third. Alabama's about a quarter. When we go back and think about prior to 1965, we had entire congressional delegations that were in no way accountable to 40% of their population, to a third of their population, to 25% of their population. And we were saying this was democracy. We have no idea what laws Congress would have passed if they had to consider those people as voters. No idea what our budget would have looked like, what people would have voted for, what the presidential returns would have looked like. Everything before 1965 is just hypothetical. And so when we encounter this at this moment, the thing that's interesting to me, and in terms of the book, is the contemporary dynamics that led to this kind of like vigilance, the return of this. And the chapter where you talk about the reaction to the black presidency was right at the center of that. And I wonder if you could talk about that some.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is consistent with your first question. This is, again, something that is troubling in the present, but familiar based on our past. And you're right, substantial numbers of African Americans in those states that you mentioned. Was Marina Jenkins, this is the head of our legal team at NDRC, filed a lawsuit in Alabama, just 18 months or so ago, because of the racial gerrymandering that was done there. 27% of the population is African American, 7 congressional districts. There should be 2 African American opportunity zones. Didn't want to do that. It's all about, the acquisition and retention of power. At the end of the day, that's what's all about. Well, and with a good dollop of racism there, because I think your students, there's a lot there. And this America that we are now in is becoming more brown. There's a demographic reality that people in power now are frightened by. In the same way that people, 100 years ago, maybe or longer than that, were concerned about what would these people of color do in South Carolina? What would they do in Mississippi? What would they do in Alabama? We have, the American experience has associated with people of color, African Americans to start, but now I think that gets expanded in the 21st century, a whole range of things about folks of color. We are, the other. And there are all kinds of negative things that flow from that characterization. Everything from more prone to violence. When it comes to medical stuff, greater capacity to absorb pain. And so you see folks getting, under anesthetized or under medicated. Not as bright. I mean, there's a whole range of things that flow from it. And the desire to hold on to power and to keep those people, the others, away from power, is what animated people back in the post-Civil War time, early 20th century, and I think motivates them now. And even at a level at times where I'm not even sure where somebody in the early 20th century, certainly post-Civil War, they got it. I mean, they understood what was motivating them. We don't want these these newly freed people, these folks who were our slaves. We don't want them to have power over us or share power with us. They understood, at least in a significant way, what they were doing. Whereas people today, in the majority, are doing things and not fully conscious of what at least one of the drivers is. And I think that's why this DeSantis attack on our history, or studying our history, I think is really so troublesome. This notion that we don't want to look at America as it really was, and what the impact of what America was, how it affects America today. That means we won't get to the America of the future that we want to have. It makes it more difficult.
So how do you respond to that? Like, what is the reasonable behavior that you encourage as a counterweight to that kind of problem?
Well, it's not, power sees nothing, without a struggle. And so the reality is that you persuade to the extent that you can, but you fight like hell, as we always have had to do. And I think that, you think about Robeson and the other great civil rights leaders. They fought for an America that they had never seen. they could only imagine. And yet they overcame what I'm sure at times must have felt like a fear that they would not be able to succeed, that the power that they had to confront was too great, and yet, they did it. So persuasion with facts, with history, I think has to be an integral part of it. But I think you also have to be prepared to fight and to be in the streets, to be in polling places, to do a whole variety of things that are consistent with what we can do in the 21st century. A lot of the tactics we learned from Dr. King and folks in the civil rights movement, but you also have to tweak them for the capacities we have now in the 21st century. Social media, a whole range of ways in which we can be effective in this fight. But fight we have to do.
One of the things that was notable to me in the period between 2008 and 2016 was kind of marked with this great exuberance, and I, personally reflected on the fact that, my father was from Georgia, he was born in 1920. Had he attempted to vote in Georgia, he would have been killed. Plain, simple. I lived in Atlanta at that time, was a delegate to the convention for Barack Obama. And so the fact that he could not vote, but I could actually vote to make the first black nominee for president in the United States history is an arc of progress that we should be very proud of. At the same time, the notable thing that I mentioned at the outset was that when people began polling in 2008, 2009 about race and people's views of race, a kind of curious statistical blip emerged, which was that some small number of white people, when questioned about the most disadvantaged group in American society, would respond whites. And in 2010, that number was bigger. And in 2012, was bigger. And in some instances, you could get a majority of particular subsets who thought that white people were the most disadvantaged group in American society.
Did you also drug test these people when they were answering this question?
Well, the thing is about it, it's like the statistical reality and there's the emotional reality.
Yeah.
The statistical reality was all of the stuff that we know, that every institution in American life produces racially disparate outcomes. But the emotional reality is not tethered to any of that. And so I wonder what it was like inside the administration as you all are governing and trying to enact things that will make the country better. And there's this building backlash, and what people were thinking about, or if this was something at the forefront of your minds, and how it was on the inside relating to that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because I think there was kind of a split. There were those of us who thought that you just push, you just push. You only got these jobs for a limited amount of time, and we have a sense of what we think is right. We have a mandate. I mean, you got to remember, Barack Obama won a big election, and we have to use that power in ways that are consistent with our assessment of where the country is, the things we need to fix, and not be concerned about the reactions. And when I say not to be concerned about the reactions, we're thinking that the reaction is really kind of in a relatively small minority of people, given the mandate or the number of people who had voted for him. Others would say, well, that seems a little, you seem to be pushing a little hard, a little fast. There's going to be a reaction. There's going to be a political reaction to this, and there could be other reactions to this. I was a little dismissive of those folks, and in retrospect, maybe a little too dismissive. I'm not sure it would have changed the things I was pushing for. I might have presented them in ways that were, a little different, because the reality is that the reaction to our first black president, first black attorney general, was a lot more substantial, unprincipled perhaps, substantial than I anticipated. And the election, the election of Donald Trump, I think, is in some ways the greatest indication of that. I'm not saying that Barack's election necessarily led to the election of Donald Trump, but the opposition to Barack and the way it was couched certainly fueled a lot of the stuff that you were talking about. I mean, people's feelings, and made it possible that somebody like a Trump could be elected. So again, there was that split. Don't worry about reactions. Let's just do what we can do in the limited time that we have. Others saying, hold on, and depending on the decision, one side or the other, would win.
Mm-hmm. Can we talk about Queens for a second?
Sure.
So I mean, we had
the Garden Borough.
That's right. We had this running joke about both of us being from Queens, along with Cheryl and Eiffel as well. And but this is actually a kind of serious point, which I think relates to this, which is, prior to 1965, to the point that you made, prior to 1965, Queens was the second whitest borough in New York City. Queens is currently the most diverse county in the United States. Yeah. And everything that happened after the 1965 Immigration Act was kind of visible in Queens. First, I was joking with a friend of mine who's Indian American, and she said that her parents came 5,000 miles to America and then refused to go more than 3 miles from the airport when they landed. We're here, good, like this will do. Is this America? All right, good, right here. And then we saw that, kind of West Indian populations, then, from Spanish-speaking Caribbean and Latin America, and all of these communities that are getting a foothold. And for me, kind of growing up in Queens, I was by the time I was old enough to kind of notice this, it was just normal. It was like, oh, okay, I go to school with all of these kids from all of these different places. We all have different backgrounds and so on. But for the other person who's from Queens, also the 45th president of the United States, his folk didn't react to all of these people coming in the same way. Yeah. And they thought that it was time to circle the wagons and everything. And I think when people ask why he was so much better at speaking that language of nativism in 2016 than that whole line of Republicans that were on that stage, it was like, well, he'd been doing it longer.
Right.
And Queens was a laboratory, for all this stuff that people were talking about later.
Well, I mean, I think that's right. The Queens that I grew up with, I'm older than you.
Like 6 months.
I don't think that's true.
So you look like you're 6 months older than me, I'll say that.
All right, well,
I got more gray than you got.
That was kind. The Queens I grew up in was really predominantly white, but everybody else was black. I mean, there was no really other significant numbers of other ethnic groups. I mean, I take the Q48 now from where I grew up in East Elmhurst to Flushing, where I used to go to the movies and all that stuff. It's like an amalgam of cultures, people from all parts of the world. It's a fundamentally different place.
800 languages.
Yeah, fundamentally different place. And I think that the point you made is a good one. Trump growing up in Queens, you could grow up in the part of Queens that he grew up in. You can construct a world there that is, with, I don't know, not physical walls, but there are walls that you can put up such that, his existence was fundamentally different than other people in other boroughs, experienced. And the desire to keep, that part of Queens in the way that it was and have the life that he led, I think is something that infused him with a view of the world, and he's acted upon that view of the world. And again, as America is afraid of the browning of this country, you got this guy who says, I got that. I know what you're talking about. I know how to handle this.
Right.
I can speak to the fears that you have, and I've got tactics that that we can use to make America great again. I mean, make America great again is looking back, make America great again. I always wonder about the again part. All right, so when did you think America was great? Like before women got the right to vote, before black people had, substantial rights and the right to vote, before people in the LGBTQ plus community were treated, if not well now, worse than. I mean, when exactly was America great? Their view, I think, of making America great again was when, June Cleaver, I don't know if you're old enough, Leave It to Beaver, she's vacuuming with pearls on in high heels,
Right.
and there's picket fences, and apparently no black people, no people of color lived next to the Beeve and, and Wally and Lumpy and all those people, That's, I think, his vision of, certainly it was, I think, probably the reality of his Queens, and taking those folks who are afraid of this changing America, letting them know that it's possible to have that, to continue to hold on to that America, in spite of the numbers. That was appealing, and was what propelled him. And I think people underestimated the power of that, the ability that he had, and the power of his message.
Yeah. Just as a aside, when you talk about making America great again, there's always been, they're not as prominent now, but like 15, 20 years ago when there were all these like 50s themed burger joints popping up. And I was like, yeah, it doesn't appeal to me. It's like, I mean, how authentic do we going to be here, But, coming back to the way that all this kind of relates to the dynamics at play, in voting, I wonder if you see differences between maybe national strategies and local strategies for defending the vote, and what, if any, possibilities for positive change come out of those two places.
I think there has to be an amalgam. I mean, I think that too often we do exactly that. We think that there's a national strategy as opposed to a straight state strategy, and I think that we need to think of them as one with a greater emphasis on the state strategy. Progressives, Democrats, we get really excited around federal elections. Everybody gets excited who's running for president. And then, so-called off-year elections, we don't vote in as great numbers. And you see as a result, 2022, not an election, not a presidential election year, and it went a little better than we thought. Could have been a lot better if people had voted in the same numbers that they voted in 2020. A lot of the things that we are most concerned about in this country, these draconian anti-choice laws, enabled by kind of a renegade Supreme Court, happen at the state level. And so making sure that we are participating at the state level, at the local level, is something that Democrats and progressives have not focused enough on. And so I think we need to do a lot more of that, while at the same time, doing the things that we in some ways have done the best, which is to use federal power to bring about the kinds of changes that we need. So I think it's both, but with a greater emphasis on things happening at the state and local level.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of the prospects of significant legislation around this, and do you see a route to the reinstitution of the Voting Rights Act, or the passage of the John Lewis bill, or really any substantial measures as it relates to voter access?
Between now and, I guess, would it be January of 2025? Zero. I mean, there's no chance coming out of the federal level. I mean, you couldn't get anything out of this House of Representatives, John Lewis bill, any voting legislation. That's just not gonna happen. We couldn't do it when Democrats controlled both the Senate and the House, because we had two senators who wouldn't do, from my perspective, the right thing and do away with the filibuster. Because if you'd done that, you could have passed those bills. So even if Democrats took over the House in 2024, you'd still have to deal with the filibuster question in the Senate. But even there, I'm a little more hopeful that in another iteration of what we had, democratic control of assuming the presidency in both houses. I think the possibility will exist, given how I hope the Senate will be constructed. But before that, you're just banging your head against a brick wall. It doesn't mean you don't talk about the issue, but I would not be expending political capital to try to do something that clearly is just not going to happen. It just not doesn't. So on the other hand, maybe then we focus on what's going on in the states and look at the things we focused on, gerrymandering in the states, attack, those who are trying to suppress the vote in the states. I think that between now and January 2025, when the new Congress comes in, that would be the place I think where our efforts could be most useful.
The interesting thing about this is ahead of the Shelby decision. By the way, I know. By the way, I spoke at Abyssinian Baptist Church for Martin Luther King Day. Like, big honor of my life to be able to speak there on Martin Luther King Day. And I mentioned the Shelby decision, and I was like, Shelby, and I caught myself. I said, I interviewed Attorney General Holder, and he said, do not attach my name to that foolishness.
Shelby County versus nope. That's like would you want to be like Dred Scott versus Holder? Would you want your name associated with that case? No. So it's just the Shelby County case.
Right. But the interesting point, one of the interesting points about this was that ahead of that decision coming down, it had been reauthorized 98-0, as you talk about in the book, 98-0 in the Senate, and 390 something to 30 something in the House, and reauthorized by 4 different presidents.
Every time it was reauthorized by a Republican president.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so how do you explain that about face, at least in terms of people's voting record? This has bipartisan support across the board, to it becoming what it is now, which is a almost unanimously partisan issue.
Yeah, I think it's a couple of things. I think it is it's that fear of the other, these demographic changes that have been there, but then kind of peak, with the election of this other president. So people are, wait a minute, we're giving these folks a little too much political power. So I think there's at least that, but I don't think you can underestimate the impact of the Shelby County decision. When the highest court in the land essentially says, America has changed. As the Chief Justice famously said, America has changed, and that just supercharged, gave fuel to folks who wanted to perhaps do this before, but didn't think it was, I'll use the term, politically correct, societally acceptable. They didn't want to be known as people who would oppose the reauthorization. But then you've got this kind of societal feeling. You've got the Supreme Court that's saying America has changed. A lot of a significant provision in the Voting Rights Act is unconstitutional. All of that allowed these politicians to say, well, I got cover now. I got cover. And so, and if I have it, and I say, Jelani, you with me on this? Well, then, and then we get a couple, and then, so there's cover from there, and then we are working now in concert, and then you're not, to try to do this in the 70s, after the bill had been passed, or the 80s, when it was reauthorized. There was a price that you had to pay, some kind of price, maybe not a political one, but a reputational one. You didn't want to be kind of the outlier, but circumstances had changed to make opposition to these things that we had, I think, all agreed on as a nation, to make opposition to that, acceptable.
This is a kind of a bigger question, but and I hope this is not a leading question, but where do you see American democracy, and to what extent, if any, are you concerned about the state of American democracy?
Well, I'm very concerned. I mean, I think what we have seen, again, I don't want to constantly go back to the Republican Party, but to have one of our two parties, if not turn their back on democracy, to turn away from it, I think that's certainly true. The authoritarian streak that you see in the Republican Party, this fascination with, adherence to this authoritarian figure is of great concern. And again, that has given cover to a whole range of things. You know, election deniers. I mean, you know, that sounds wacky, it's kind of crazy, you know, but that has a really negative impact. I mean, our elections only work when, you know, you count the votes and one party says, oh, we lost, you know, all right. And if the party that lost doesn't say that we lost, that really kind of upsets, you know, how our system is supposed to work. So with this court, you know, what it did with the Shelby County decision, what it did with the Rucho decision, saying that you couldn't hear partisan gerrymandering cases, what it may do with regard to this ridiculous independent state legislature doctrine, what it might do with the Section 2 cases in the Voting Rights Act that it has before it. You're knocking out some of the underpinnings, you know, that we have constructed that have made this democracy better. You know, I don't think, to go back to one of the questions you said before, we got to realize, I'm sounding kind of really negative about where we are as a nation now, and yeah, I am concerned, but I have to always acknowledge, and we should always acknowledge, we are better now than we were 50 years before, and 50 years, you know, before that. We've made progress, but I am concerned that progress that we have made, that march of progress, is in the process of being halted and potentially even reversed. So I'm really worried about the state of our democracy. And the 2022 midterms were an indication that, you know, we can, you know, the things are holding, but that could be an aberration. You know, 24 could put us right in a much worse place.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that kind of strikes me about that is the extent to which you know, it connects to these historical themes, you know, and one of the quotes that I'm always deploying, because unfortunately it has a lot of relevance, is W.E.B. Du Bois, who said that America will destroy ignorance, or ignorance will destroy America. And you know, I sometimes go like, all right, well, who's ahead on the scorecards? You know, it's like America and ignorance tied at 6. You know. You know, we're going into extra innings. And so I think that in terms of the kind of historical parallel, when we were looking in 2020 at Fulton County, you know, which is one of the places where Donald Trump, you know, accused, you know, people of having rigged the vote. When we were looking at Fulton County, Georgia, I went back to like how black people got the vote. Like we were saying, the entire election is going to depend on like what happens in Fulton County, which is basically Atlanta.
Right.
And I go back to 1906 when there was the race riot in Atlanta, which was targeting black people because they were voting in too large a number. Right. And to go back before that to the way that black people in Fulton County got the right to vote in the first place with the 15th Amendment, or at least black men, you know, when the Republican Party, you know, proposed the 15th Amendment, you know, they had one objective, and that objective was to prevent the Confederacy from regaining the kind of political power it had in 1860 and 1861, and being powerful enough to rip the country in half. And they thought that black people, that the black vote would be a bulwark against a white supremacist movement that threatened to destroy American democracy. And in 2020, as we were looking at those election returns come in, and then 2 weeks later when we were looking at those election returns in the Senate races, it was like, more or less you're asking black voters in 2020 to do the same thing that you were asking them to do in 1870. which is to be a bulwark against a white supremacist movement that threatens to destroy American democracy. And so when I think about it in that context, everything else, January 6th included, makes sense to me. I do wonder if you think people are generally taking this issue seriously enough.
Not enough people are taking this seriously enough, you know? I think too many people are consumed with just the everyday things that make up our lives without giving sufficient consideration to our system in stress, our system in danger. And it's going to take the involvement of greater numbers of people. Black folks alone cannot save this country. We can be part of a coalition that will help stop these, you know, these negative forces, but it's going to take more than that. And it's going to take people, you know, less concerned about, I don't know, the Kardashians, you know, less concerned about, you know, all the kind of peripheral things that take up so much of our time as we're looking at our phones.
I am really concerned about Tristan's behavior, though. I have to tell you, like.
Well, I'll tell you, I don't know who the hell Tristan is. But who's Tristan?
He's like the father of like half the population at this point. So, like,
is that the basketball player?
That's the basketball player.
Oh yeah, Tristan Thompson. I know. Okay, I know. All right. So I am a little familiar with the zeitgeist here. But yeah, not enough folks, I think, are concerned. And that's what the movements that I have had the ability to either be a part of or to look at from afar, because I was kind of young, really engaged, you know, significant portions of the American people. Whether it was the civil rights movement, that after Bloody Sunday, you know, John Lewis, Edmund Pettus Bridge, 1965, you know, moved the American people. Didn't mean everybody was down there marching, but raised in the consciousness of the American people, you know, a notion, well, this is kind of unfair. Why are we doing this? And that leads to, you know, voting rights in 1965, the anti-war movement, you know, on this campus, you know. We didn't take finals until I was a junior, you know. We're on strike all the time. That was a disheartening thing when we couldn't come up with a strike in junior year.
It's like I got hit the library.
Like, oh man, what finals? But I mean, that engaged, you know, significant numbers of people in opposition to the war. I mean, we didn't pull out of Vietnam because, you know, we had militarily reached our objectives. I mean, that war was ended because it did not have the support, ultimately, over time, of the American people. And that, I think, is what is going to have to happen here as well. Yeah, black folks have got to be motivated, and we can be the core, the glue, perhaps, but it's going to take, you know, significant portions of the majority community to be involved. Although not necessarily a majority of the majority community. I mean, you can build this coalition now with this Changing America, with maybe, you know, I mean, I remember talking to David Axelrod about this, you know, what does a winning Democratic coalition look like? And it depends on the state, but I mean, overall, you know, 35, 40% of the, you know, no Democratic presidential candidate has won the white vote since Lyndon Johnson, I think, something like that. So if you have an engaged population of communities of color and a significant portion of the white community, you can, that's a sufficient number of people to, you know, protect that which needs to be protected and to make the progress that needs to be had.
I don't know if we're doing a Q&A. I'm just going to pull an audible here and like and say that we will. So
I think that was the plan.
Yeah. Oh, okay, great. So what we're going to do is this. We're going to have this this clarification beforehand, which is to say, a question is an interrogative sentence, generally noted by the inflection at the end, is a request for information, which is differentiated from a statement which offers information. We would like the former, not the latter. moreover, we would like those questions to be expressed as succinctly as possible, which will enable us to get to as many of them as possible. And so, if we're all good on that, then questions.
So one way that a significant number of black people are disenfranchised in this country is the fact that the District of Columbia is not a state. And I wonder if you think there's any chance of that ever happening, or is it even worth working on?
Yeah, in our unfinished march, I have a whole list of things that I think we need to do to enhance our democracy, strengthen our democracy. Some of them are pretty difficult. Electoral college. That's going to involve a constitutional amendment, or there's a voter compact. But that's going to be difficult. One of the things I suggest or say we should have is voting rights, full voting rights for people in the District of Columbia and in Puerto Rico. Doesn't involve a constitutional amendment. I mean, that's just Congress can pass that, President can sign it. And so I think, that's something that is morally worth fighting for, politically doable, and from a Democratic perspective, Democratic Party perspective, also something that I think that you'd want to push for. I mean, you've got more people in the District of Columbia than in a couple of states. It would balance out, the fact that, North Dakota, South Dakota. I mean, why? Think about that. Why do we have 2 Dakotas, right? I mean, and the reality was that was done to create, 4 senators as opposed to 2. So it's not like, when I say it's morally right and politically smart, like I'm saying something that is inconsistent with American history. I mean, we've done this before, and but I think it's possible. I think that's entirely possible. Not necessarily easy, but that is something that is, I think, on my long list. I'd put that close to the top of things that are possible.
I have a question. I don't have a mic, but I have a question.
We have a mic in 1 second.
You're both African-American men, and I thought I would ask a question that has been dogging me since the 2020 election. As you both know,